Thank you so much, Angelica, for having us, and thank you, Jennifer, and everyone else for organizing this. We're very excited to be here. So before we begin our presentation, we just thought it would be good to share a short video to kind of give you a sense of, some of the work that we do, but also the kind of spaces that we gather in, and what our actions kind of, embody, so that there's you can kind of put an image to the work that we do as well.
Welcome to the third Anti-Columbus Day tour, and more.
Let us acknowledge the people of Puerto Rico, a colonial territory of the United States, annexed by Roosevelt.
We begin today by acknowledging that we are standing on the homeland of the Lenape, whose land was stolen to create settler states and who continue to live under siege, surveillance, and colonial structural violence.
And this we have to go over some steps so that we are all active, decolonizing, reclaiming, and in reimagining these halls. We will do this together. Put pressure on the museum. We'll walk separately, we'll walk together.
We'll walk together.
We are the ones that they spoke into the wind, the ones that they gave life to. Hajona Hasklito left. From this point there will be beauty, and all I see is beautiful faces.
And now, Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Hall. Theodore Roosevelt viewed land, territories, animals, and people as objects to be tamed, controlled, and at times destroyed. His corrosive legacy haunts the AMNH, from the monument outside to the adoration of his repellent ideals in the museum's rotunda and Roosevelt Memorial Hall.
Colonia, fire, fire, to the colonizers, fuego, fuego, fuego la colonia.
So just to kind of give, an overview, me and Amin are MTL, but Decolonize This Place is facilitated by MTL Plus, which is 8 other people. We're a group of artists, organizers, thinkers, professors, art historians, curators, and who basically kind of come together to form Decolonize This Place, which has been doing different actions around New York City, connecting struggles between, indigenous sovereignty, Black liberation, Palestine, but really thinking about what does a decolonial abolitionist and an anti-imperial framework mean for institutions like, the Museum of Modern Art, or like the Brooklyn Museum, or the Whitney Museum of Art, or, American Museum of Natural History. One of the things that, we really think about is, what does Zapatista say, which is walking, we ask questions. And so most of the times we're also very much interested in our failures rather than successes, and we try to learn from that history. So, me and Amin met at ICP. We were doing a photography course together. This was in 2010. And then in 2011, Occupy Wall Street happened. And, we were both not from the United States. We both kind of it was the first time we were kind of engaging in like a political organizing space in the United States. And so for us, it was like, okay, this, what was amazing about the movement was to kind of understand the kind of strategies and tactics of direct action that were playing out. But what was also crazy was to see how much the movement was very United States centric, and specifically white middle class, even though a lot of the organizers in the movement were people of color. And, once again, thinking about why Occupy on already stolen land, and like where do all struggles like Palestine, or struggles like, at that same time, you also had Egypt going on, there was Spain going on. How do we actually build this kind of, international kind of solidarity? And so from there, we went to, organize, and after, learning through the failures of Occupy Wall Street, we organized around Black lives in Palestine to kind of connect those struggles into New York City, into the heart of the empire. And from there, from these kind of struggles and movements, over the years, over the last 10 years, then we kind of came to Decolonize This Place as a framework which does not think of these, struggles as issue silos, that, Black liberation, for example, is not disconnected from indigenous sovereignty or Palestine or capitalism. But versus we're thinking of this as a whole settler structure, how do settler institutions operate? And then what can be our responses and what does it look like? Amin, do you want to continue? I'll pull up the manual in the meantime.
Yeah, just to kind of highlight a few points because we're going to anchor it in some visuals. I think to say it a little bit differently, we've been doing this work since 2010, but it's a work that comes from a movement place. So we think of movement generated art, movement generated theory and aesthetics. These kind of things where the artist is embedded in struggle and is responsible to communities that are engaged in struggle, that the aesthetics have a different temporality that emerges from that, that institutions are not neutral, that that institutions like museums are part of an art system that is embedded in capitalism, that reflects the same racial capitalism, that reflects the same kind of issues and concerns that we see in society writ large. And then acting against, alongside, under, above the institution is our way of trying to engage in struggle to get free and to build solidarities with others, where we don't necessarily recognize those walls that separate us, and try to think of these institutions, not the physical institutions, not the building, not the name, but these spaces in which there is art, aesthetics, and beauty, but also a lot of power and control, where it's mediating the type of conversations that we're having, that it's mediating the kind of epistemology and ideology that's circulating. In that, you know, right now I saw a post, curators asking for Palestinian artists, as if the war on Gaza or the war on Palestinians or the settler colonial project requires an artist or two showing at Moma. But this is what these institutions are engaged in. And so what is the role of representation in broader struggles? And this is not coming from a place, these are just prefaces, but it's not coming from a place in which we don't love art or we don't believe in beauty. But it is one that says we don't start from the position that it's better to have Moma than not to have Moma. We start from the position of how are people doing, who's included and who's excluded. Do we want to assimilate in the settler colonial project? Do we think that there's one type of art, that there's one type of aesthetics? Who dictates that? We try to imagine art that measures up to us, not the other way around. So this is coming from a different place. It's not anti a museum or for a museum, but it doesn't give a fuck whether the museum stays or goes. And its first question is, then what do you do with the art?
Yeah, this is, we wanted to share, this is the Decolonial Study, Reflection and Action Manual. I shared the link for it in the chat. People should go ahead and look at it, in detail. But what this manual does is basically put together our learnings and our failures over the last few years as Decolonize This Place, in terms of what we did with different institutions and what we were thinking about, while we were, either doing actions or, pushing through different letters. But it gives you a kind of history and sense of how we've grown from like 2016 specifically. And one of the things I think, just to share, for us, museums, are also spaces of encounters for our movements, especially when, after Occupy Wall Street and after, Black Lives and Indigenous, going through the whole Standing Rock movement stuff. One of the things that we learned was that when we were on the streets, a lot of times our struggle was actually between the state, the police, and then the protesters. That's what it kind of got diluted to a lot of the times, even with, when we were like, most of the times the headlines would be these many protesters got arrested for this action. But really the kind of conversation or the nuance or the kind of, struggles that we all come from, there wasn't really a place to hash that out. And so what happens with the museums is that most of the museums with their board members, I mean, Moma being that, Warren Candace at Whitney, we'll go through all of them, they're not separate from the larger society, right? Museums are not exceptional places. So universities are also not exceptional places. They're very similar in the way that, there's spaces of pedagogy, there's spaces of learning, there's spaces of imagination, there's spaces of memory, There are spaces where people go to become either citizens or cultured, or to gain some sort of knowledge or to experience beauty, right? But these institutions are also, they're, specifically in the United States, they're built on settler colonial violence, which means that they still operate within the same art market and art system. But art also, and institutions also, can be a space of sanctuary. It can also be the places where our movements gather and demand, what the art is trying to do. And so, with that in mind, this is, the starting of, our practice. This is in 2014. Just wanted to give a visual of like the kind of solidarity work that was happening between Black lives and Palestine. This is when, Eric Garner and Akai Gurley were murdered in New York. And it was at the same time the Gaza war was happening. And there was this kind of renewed solidarity that already exists within, the Black liberation history and the Palestinian history. And so once again, the question for us was like, what do we do as artists? What is the role of the artist? And so one thing that we think about is the artist as organizer, right? Engaged in movement generated art, movement generated theory. And then apart from that, one of the things that we learned, this was from Grace Lee Boggs, was what does it mean to be doing visionary organizing versus reactionary organizing? When we're inheriting a world that's built on crisis upon crisis, crisis upon crisis, do we just respond to the crisis, or we actually look at the structural problems and actually think about what are visionary ways that we need to assemble? And then apart from that, quite often when we do these actions, the way they're reported in the media is like, oh, protesters shut down the museum. These many protesters talked about this board member to leave. But what you're not seeing is that, most of the people who actually show up for these actions might not even want to identify as protesters. These are people, once again, who are artists, curators, historians, organizers from communities that are not even related to art, but, gather there because of the violence that these institutions enact. And so, with that in mind, so these actions that we're talking about, as we showed in the video, they're not just about negating the institution and saying, oh, this is what's bad, but it's also about gathering together and enacting a future that we want to see in the action, while kind of, coming together and making these relations. So a lot of the work that we're going to talk about is actually relational, and it's not just me and Amin. There's many, apart from Decolonize This Place, there's been, the Anti-Columbus Day Tour, for example, had like over 30 different groups that we kind of came together. We're going to be talking about Strike Moma, very similar. There's many people who have been part of this conversation, and we learn together and we move together from that. And these moments are then those learning points and also unlearning points for our movements, right? And so 2014 was a really important pivotal point for us, because things were just getting, we had the Arab uprisings which just happened, Occupy Wall Street just had happened. So there was this kind of global movement of deoccupations of squares, against capitalism. But what we saw specifically, like I said, in the United States, was this problem with things being very United States centric and not really having an anti-imperialist kind of approach to things. And so, the Black Lives Matter and the Palestine action was kind of our way of kind of weaving that solidarity into the heart of the empire. And then this is at the Guggenheim, once again, this is Guggenheim. It's not different from how these institutions have been set up in the US, but Guggenheim is opening its branch, in Abu Dhabi, called Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. There's already a Louvre Abu Dhabi. There's already an NYU Abu Dhabi. It's, on this place called Saadiyat Island, which literally translates to Island of Happiness. And what's the claim that Guggenheim is trying to make? Once again, is like, oh, there hasn't been, art history has been too Western for a long time, right? And so we need to change that and shift the focus just from, like, for example, Guggenheim Bilbao or like New York, and think about it in Abu Dhabi, which kind of covers the whole region of the, the MENA region, as they say, Middle East and also South Asia. But once again, who is building these institutions, right? This is indebted workers who are coming from South Asian countries, Nepal, Sri Lanka, also a lot of workers coming from Africa, Philippines. And it's the same structure of capitalism and labor that you see in, for example, Guggenheim, New York as well. And so for us, some of the work that we wanted to do was actually, what does that solidarity look like, and who actually needs to come into the struggle? And that's kind of also some of our, organizing logic, is like, who's in the room, who is not in the room, who needs to be in the room. And so in the case of, for example, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, we were like, okay, it's not that we are here to represent workers who are already struggling and existing every day in Abu Dhabi, but how can we amplify that from our own positions of understanding what does work mean in the arts, right? And what does it mean to engage with the museum as a labor struggle as well? And so And then also, Abu Dhabi being a debt finance boom, very similar to, like a lot of the, students at NYU, for example, is NYU Abu Dhabi, they have largest student debt in the United States. Artists, who are mostly part of the same art system that usually places like Guggenheim and MoMA, they're part of dictating that. Immigration rights organizations, and then, places like Taxi Drivers, Workers Alliance. These were all kind of relations that kind of get built in the kind of, process of this organizing happening. Do you want to add anything before I keep going, Amin?
No, I think you should keep going, and I think that you should probably cover these pages faster so we can get to Strike Momo.
Do you want to go? Yeah. Do you want to do this?
No, I just run through them.
Okay. And so, so then from the kind of, and I think kind of from the understanding of organizing around Guggenheim, Occupy museums, Black Lives, Indigenous, like the Standing Rock Solidarity stuff, and then also the Palestine work. This is when we kind of, we came across also decolonization is not a metaphor from, Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne. And they have a paragraph which we kind of made into this diagram, which you can see on the screen. The first point, that's Patrick Wolf's point, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. But in the diagram, you see what a settler colonial nation does. It's, it's built on seasoned indigenous land. It's a settler colonial nation state. It operates like an empire, and it has internal colonialism and external colonialism, which is, part of like the dispossessed people. But with external colonialism, you have displacement, migration, wars abroad. And with internal colonialism, you have, apart from being on seized indigenous land, you have enslavement, low wages, military recruitment, gentrification, right? So when this is the kind of system and structure you're operating within, then the question of what does decolonial solidarity look like, that's what we were asking when we started to think about decolonize this place. And that's when we came up with the 6 strands of struggle that Angelica mentioned before as a starting point to kind of build these relations, not just theoretically, or through aesthetics or culture. All of that was there, but also in action. And that's when we started doing actions like this is the Brooklyn Museum. We've been doing actions at the Brooklyn Museum for last it's been through different phases. The first one which happened was actually around this show called This Place, which was part of art washing the occupation of Palestine. And then afterwards it was around 2 curators, 2 white curators who were hired, one for African art and photography. And we asked for a decolonization commission in relation to that. But what was amazing about all these actions were that they operated on several planes, right? So for example, when you're doing an action on Palestine, you can't be doing an action on Palestine on stolen indigenous land and not be talking about stolen indigenous land or gentrification processes that museum is engaged in. And so that was some of the relationship work that we did with the Brooklyn Museum. And I think you can see that in the demands that get reflected with the Decolonization Commission. And the Decolonization Commission in this case was one demand. And I think I just wanted to make that clear. It's not that if these 7 points, if the museum was to follow these 7 points, the museum would be decolonized. The Decolonization Commission is really a yes and an acceptance to initiating the process of understanding the historical violence that the institution has been engaged in. And then, of course, thinking of reparations, repatriations, and all of that, but then dismantling the institution to see what futures could look like that are for communities that it has been part of, oppressing. And so in the context of, for example, the Brooklyn Museum, it was like, of course, territorial acknowledgement, land acknowledgement, and that extends to the archives as well, a full decolonial inventory of what's in these institutions, especially with the Brooklyn Museum and the American Museum of Natural History. We have no idea what they have. Like there's artifacts, there's, remains, and those are things that, and then, I mean, you look at what's happening in Philadelphia with the MOVE stuff. We have no idea on what these institutions hold. These institutions are also part of, processes of gentrification, signing up for BDS around Palestine. So these were just some of the questions to kind of hash out, to think about what is the role of institutions, especially art museums today. And then, we moved on to, and I think this is important, especially as artists, to think about exhibition spaces. So we were offered an exhibition space at the Artist Space, which is a art gallery downtown in Tribeca, whose rent is actually about $18,000 per month. And one of the things that we were thinking about and what they were interested in was our archives. And for us, our archives are active. They're not something that happened in the past. For us, archives are also action. And so when we got this space, we started thinking, instead of thinking of it as a space that's, as the static space, which has things on the walls, or, or even just thinking about art isolated from people, which is what these institutions do, is isolate the art from its people, because art is usually considered as private property, right? And it's supposed to have insurance and it needs to be on the wall. But what we thought about in this case is what can we think about as art as commons, but also like opening up a common space for movement building. And so there was, you can see there was food, there was film screenings, there was cultural events, there was art building, there was actions. That was all happening over the span of 3 years. Again, once again, those 6 stands of struggle and action was a huge part of this. And so if you would see, what would happen was every single time you would go into the space, the banners would change based on what was going on with the actions, but also sometimes the banners would be on the streets. It was 2-story, different things could be happening. It became an organizing hub for movements around the city because it was central, so a lot of gentrification work could happen from these spaces. Do you want to add anything, Amin? Okay. And then, just this idea of training and, the kind of, art is training and practice of freedom. This is something Gayatri Spivak says. It's once again goes back to the point that decolonization does not really have an end goal. It's a process of unlearning and unsettling and building along the way these relations that are within those kind of framework. And so I already showed the video. So the Anti-Columbus Day tour, all of that was kind of part of that relational building. And with the Anti-Columbus Day tour, with the American Museum of Natural History, we had 3 demands. Rename the day, which was renaming the day from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Removing the statue, which is this kind of Theodore Roosevelt statue right in front of the museum. It's a racist statue which has a Black man and a Native man, as if they're part of the kind of that they're part of the project, the settler project together. Since these actions, de Blasio decided to said that we would remove the statue. Nothing's really happened as of now, but we'll see what happens. And then the third demand was respecting the ancestors. And that's I think it's also important that we think about the idea of impossible demands, right? Where are demands which actually question the whole structure of the institution. So respecting the ancestors really in this case means which is, American Museum of Natural History, which is a hall of white supremacy because of the way it classifies people and their, art and their culture, is to actually rethink what history means in this context, right? This is an institution which is also where the eugenicist movement was there. And so there's a lot of shit, that this institution has been part of, and what does unsettling that mean, and what does holding memory mean, and what does abolition also mean in the context of these institutions. So abolition not just being donated only to prisons, but also what does abolition mean when we think about universities and museums. So very quickly, going to the Whitney, this is, I think we can talk more about it in the Q&A. But the Whitney was very much part of the same process, and once again thinking about decolonization. In the case of the Whitney, you had Warren Canaders, who was the vice chair of the board. He is somebody who produces tear gas. He's since divested from this company, but he was producing tear gas that was used on the Tijuana border. Palestine, Egypt, prisons in the U.S., everywhere. But the question once again was what are these people doing on the board of institutions that are that we are part of? These are community and spaces that we are part of. And then it ended in we did 9 weeks of art and action. It ended with Candace being gone. But once again, for us, it wasn't about just Candace leaving. It wasn't just about one bad person on the board. It's the whole system that needs to be thought through. And to remind ourselves, Whitney was something that actually began because of the workers inside who released a letter. There was 100 workers within the Whitney Museum who released a letter around what are institutions, what is the role of institutions today when things like this come to the forefront, be it around sexual harassment, around colonial violence, around wars. What is the role of institutions and how do they process these things? And since then, we've seen institutions are very quick to kind of, offer up letters, let's say around, after the George Floyd movement around, Black lives, but they're not changing or restructuring, what they are inherently, right? They're not talking about, let's say, stolen land or even, most recently, Palestine, for that example. And one last thing I would say is for people, it's much easier to understand, okay, when you're talking about decolonization and restitution with institutions that are like American Museum of Natural History or Brooklyn Museum that hold artifacts and remains and and spiritual beings of people, to be like, okay, of course that must be given back. But when it comes to institutions like the Whitney or the Museum of Modern Art, it's much more difficult for people to understand that how these are also colonial institutions. And that's we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But these institutions are also built on colonial violence and plunder. And and we need to continue thinking about what that means for us as artists, engaged in these practices. Do you want to take this, Amin, please? I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think that the trajectory so far is that we started with Occupy Wall Street. We did a few things where we pivoted towards institutions with the Guggenheim. We realized that boycotts are useful, but at the same time, the framework by which you wage a struggle, if it's around human rights, it's delimiting of the type of leverage that we have. So we didn't get far with Guggenheim. And then when we got a show at Artist Space, we decided we're going to have it for 3 months, take it over, and try to build a decolonial formation that has more power, that gets its power from communities and not from the art world, which was a turning point in the kind of leverage that we can exercise in the art world. So from there, we continued our pressure on the American Museum of Natural History, which is, a very kind of, ass backwards institution. The Brooklyn Museum, which, some would claim is more progressive, but has been an agent of gentrification and holder of resources and Black art and objects that were looted. So let me turn this off. And then from there, from the Brooklyn Museum, this idea of the Whitney, where the struggle got launched from inside, which was critical. So then we had to figure out what does solidarity look from the outside, and how can we build a campaign that continues the pressure. So we introduced a container called 9 weeks. And then week 1, it was tear gas, and week 9 was decolonization. So this idea of action, organizing, pedagogy, consistency becomes a very important thing in which you produce alternative knowledges in the process of doing. A lot of communities that otherwise wouldn't go to the Whitney ended up going to the Whitney for free. All of these things that we do are not with permission. This is very important, right? These are transgressive acts that seek to reclaim and unsettle and create a different set of relationships. Can you go down it on the images? Okay, so here's a timeline and a fuck the police poem. Because after the Whitney, we thought to ourselves, we've built enough power and enough capacity that we need to go from the museum to the city. And that's when we started focusing on police. This was about a year before the George Floyd stuff. So, which is the anniversary was yesterday for the murder of George Floyd. But one of the things that we thought was important on the path from the museum to the city is to make a stop at the Ford Foundation. Because the Ford Foundation the Ford Foundation was created after May 68 as a mode of soft power against Black power and against Black liberation in this country, right? So it's alongside the funding around NGO industrial complex. We know this because during this time, it was the Ford Foundation that actually got NGOs to agree to 4 new prisons in New York City. And we got Ford Fellows to organize against the Ford Foundation. And so this was a protest. On the right is how to take down monuments. So this idea of making knowledge operational and actually more horizontal. Continuing it down. Some of the actions of the FTP formation in the city, where we took over subway lines, feed the people, banner drops, autonomous banner drops. There's a way in which we organize that again doesn't recognize the separation of like, I belong to this institution, I belong to that institution. It's more of a desire driven, which is like, how do you want to live, and how do you want to be free, and who do you want to be free with, and who do you want to exit from this structure with some posters, and then the last image.
Yeah, I think I'll just I sent the link to the manual, and please go ahead and read these different communiques to kind of get a further sense of some of the work. But I'll read this last page, and then we can talk about Strike Moma for a little bit. So the work reflected in these pages, condensing years, helps us breathe. It is only possible because of deep politics of friendship and ethos of relational organizing and strong belief that not only do things not have to be this way, but in fact, we must live as if it could be different based on what we choose to do and how we choose to live. This work is also the product of many people, colleagues, comrades, participants, family members, lovers, friends, and grassroots groups. We thank all those who put in the time and love to usher something powerful and beautiful into the world and to hold space for each other. We also thank those who used their camera, social media, wrote pictures, made videos, brought family and friends, and organized. Movement generated anything is always better. If any image should have been credited and we did not, we apologize in advance that it was not intentional. Finally, for all those who wonder about wins as a metric of success, we share, we walk, we do not run, because we are going very far. I think,
Maybe switch to Strike Moma.
Yeah, I was going to do that. So I think this brings us to, this is a manual that we kind of put together earlier this year in January as a space to kind of reflect as well and study on like what have been, some of the kind of learnings from the kind of organizing work that's been happening in New York City with different groups. And, this is now we're on to a movement called Strike Moma. We're right now, this Friday would be week 8 of the movement. But Strike Moma basically comes from the learnings of different groups organizing around different museum spaces over the last 10 years. Learnings from from failures and successes of Occupy museums, from Gulf labor, from global to luxury faction to decolonize this place, to Moma Divest, and many
Guerrilla
more
Girls,
organizing around
and
Guerrilla
the
Girls,
whole lineage of the 60s.
Thinking also about the situationists and the surrealists, really thinking about all the different movements, and especially in an anti-colonial framework, what does that mean for us to gather? And then, specifically from the failures of the Whitney Museum, as I said, what we realized is what happened at the Whitney Museum was that once Warren Candace was gone, things became back to status quo. And it's very similar to, how Trump is gone, right? Or when Trump is oh, finally we are done with Trump and now we can live in a better, society and system. Not that was not, we needed a Trump. Of course, it's, we don't want Trump, but at the same time, questions around decolonization around the Whitney and the Brooklyn Museum are still outstanding. They're not reliant on, one board member being going. And so when, when Leon Black kind of emerged, as somebody who's connected to Jeffrey Epstein, and that was part of the conversation, one of the things that we were thinking about is how do we actually talk about the kind of interconnected directorate that exists at the MoMA, right? It's not even so it's not about this one board member who's bad and who needs to go, but we really need to look at this whole institution and see what power it holds, the kind of vertical power it holds on the art system, on artists, on curators and communities, where these board members, are executing, there's for example, mining in Dominican Republic with the Cisneros. There's, the bombs that were dropped in Gaza the last 2 weeks, that was, the Crown family is part of producing those at General Dynamics. If you look at General Dynamics alone, you can see they've been, handed many military contracts all around South America, Chile, Colombia. And so these are places, their board members on the board of MoMA are part of the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. And this is all part of communities that we kind of traverse through. And so do you want to talk about the frameworks of struggle document, Amin?
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just putting something in the chat, but I might as well say it. One thing just in relation to what Nitasha was saying, and we'll try to, I'm going to try to just do a quick summary of Strike MoMA because I think it can be a topic of conversation, right? But the thing, we say decolonization. I think that decolonization is context specific. it relates to land, air, and water. It's not a representational thing, right? It's about enunciation. But what is important, I think, when you think about this terminology, is to distinguish decolonization from indigenizing and indigenous struggle. Decolonization, depending on the context, can be it's much broader. Of course, it's about land back. That's without a question. But decolonization also necessitates abolition. So these terminologies are not issue silos, and they don't relate to one group of people. We're in a moment right now in which the shared political horizon of how do we organize socio-political economic life is on the table. These are frameworks for how we redo, undo, and realign with people that we want to live and get free with, as opposed to other kind of politics in which we don't, identify. So, strike Moma. I think that just let's leave it on the contents, because I also have the pamphlet here. I think what we were thinking about with Moma at the time is like, we got asked by Hyperallergic to make a statement. And the only thing we can come up with is a statement that's less than 500 words. And it was titled, fuck Moma. And it was coming from this place of like, having done all this work around museums, it was a point of just like, we need to do something different. It's almost like these institutions continue to think that what we're talking about is a PR problem that can be fixed with PR, that can be fixed with a conference or a conversation. These conversations in which they say, okay, we listened to you, now go home. So one of the strategic moves in this document is to actually put out this document in advance. This document is 3,000 words or 4,000 words. It's been workshopped with 70 people across various struggles in the city. Recognizes that an anti-imperial dimension needs to be applied to these institutions, where it's not simply just about Black liberation or land back and indigenous sovereignty. It's about these institutions being complicit in ongoing harm against our communities and are dictating the type of aesthetics that has value and not, so that it's creating a rat race, and it's an ideological battleground in which wealthy people find their time there and hang out and art wash their wealth and do all these things. So how are we going to do it? And I think we had a lot of consultations, and our thinking was, we need to exit. So this is drawing on the Black radical tradition. This is not an idea we came up with. The idea of abolition is one that's not about just a dismantling. It's about making present the futures you want to see. So what are the futures that we want to see as we go towards encountering Moma? And how do we make their wall irrelevant so that the inside and outside can come together and figure it out? How can you destabilize Moma? How can you destabilize its brand? How can you not recenter it in the process of doing actions? So we didn't enter the museum. We wrote our thoughts in advance. We circulated them widely. This document became the basis for a politics that is emerging in this city. And then we said, based on this kind of work, we are going to launch 10 weeks of art, action, and conversation in which these complex propositions that we're putting forward that are almost hard to imagine and that some would say are just gestural and not real. We said we're going to use art, aesthetics, action, organizing, conversations in a plaza across Moma for 10 weeks and online as a way to facilitate a conversation around these issues that isn't mediated by the regime that you want to get rid of. Because when we say Moma, we need to be very precise about what we mean. We mean the regime of Moma that is about capital, that is about control, right? That is about oligarchs on this thing, in which they're using art, they're using aesthetics, they're holding it captive. It's not like they're not protecting certain artworks, but what they are in the process of protecting it is also kind of taking it out of circulation, out of livability, out of, in a way, it's just like part of what is being done here is how do we liberate the institution and how do we liberate the art, right? How do these institutions become places of sanctuary? Now, these questions are not meant to just be put out in the world. If you're going to put them out, you have to try to figure it out. So this is what the 10 weeks are. And they're launching of a process. And if you look at the end of the document, it's very operational. And it says, first of all, this document doesn't have signatories. And then the steps forward is phase 1 is strike MoMA, 10 weeks of art, action, and conversation. And then phase 2, convening for a just transition to a post-MoMA future that will be in the fall. And that'll be citywide in New York City and also for people that are not in New York City. And it'll be shaped by a spokes council of stakeholders and independent of the authority of MoMA. This convening, held at the end of 10 weeks at some point, will determine the next steps for disassembling the museum in light of its harmful history, determining the mechanics of divestment and transfer of assets, the redistribution of properties, and the repurposing of infrastructure, establishing funds for reparation, rematriation, and indigenous land restoration, sustain support for just transition of workers to cooperative self-management and solidarity economies. As MoMA winds down and we extract our imagination from its orbit, our energies, resources, and labor power will be freed up for creating alternatives in its place, alternatives controlled by workers and communities, not billionaires and their enablers. And this is a first step for a citywide process. And then maybe just show the Palestine letter as the last thing that we put out, and then the flyers, and then we're done.
This is something that came out last week as the occupation of Palestine continues. There was a letter around MoMA's ties to violence against Palestinians. I already shared how different board members they've been part of, from like the bombs that are dropped on Gaza to birthright trips to Israel to Lauder, who is part of this IHRA definition, which basically proves standing up for Palestine as anti-Semitism, something that all the universities are affected by. I would just read the first, you can find the letter up here, but I can just read the first paragraph of this. So we, the undersigned artists, critics, scholars, and organizers, are writing to express our support for the Palestinian struggle against Israeli colonial rule and its apartheid system. We feel it is urgent to highlight the connections between the ongoing violence of Israel against the Palestinian people and a leading institution of art system, namely the Museum of Modern Art. This letter aims to build decolonial solidarity across borders by drawing attention to MoMA's entanglement with the mutually reinforcing projects of settler colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism in Palestine, the US, and around the world. When we focus on the interlocking directorate of the MoMA board, the museum becomes visible as a shared site of action for our interconnected struggles. This work against the all too frequent isolation and exceptionalization of Palestine and strengthens the bond between Free Palestine, indigenous sovereignty, Black freedom movements, and all other movements for land, life, and liberation from Puerto Rico to Kashmir and beyond. And so, I think I'll stop sharing, and we can open up to a conversation. But I think the few things that I would like to say about Strike MoMA is, this idea of the exit, right? Like, it's about, it's not like, like we said, it's not just about negating the institutions and saying this is what's bad about it, or this is what needs to be changed, is also enacting those futures right now. And we know that these institutions are not going to be the place where we can actually think about freedom or what does art really mean in the kind of decolonial and abolitionist context, when a lot of our communities have already been on strike against these museums, right? And so what we're seeing is also with this push for diversity and equity and inclusion is that you're seeing, works being included by, people who come from these communities, and these are all our communities put together. But at the same time, this is further back going into assimilating into the same system. It's not changing anything, right? We're just seeing it's an aesthetic difference that is being made on the kind of art systems kind of level. And so for us, then, what does exiting mean? Also means that, what are we going to do? How are we going to reorient to each other? What does aesthetics mean for us? And that's when we think about this idea of diversity of tactics and diversity of aesthetics. It's not about having a vertical, horizontal institution that has power and hold on what aesthetics mean, and or what art means, but also that it could be a space for freedom and unlearning and pedagogy and memory that does not look like something that's part of this private collection, or that does not look like art being part of thinking about it in the context of private property. One last thing I would say is I would highly recommend to watch Modernity is an Imperial Crime, which is a short video by Ariella Azule. I mean, if you could drop it in the chat, I think that would be good, because what she does in the video is really talk about how modern art is also based on imperial plunder, right? And that actually, modern art allowed, artists to put colonial violence in the past, as if that's not connected to what's happening. But if you look at, with the Rockefellers or anything, you see that actually, both, people like, descendants of looters, their alibis, all of that benefit from the system and continue to benefit from it. And so, we use this line in our document, which says their archives are our receipts, which means that the archives can actually, and this is in Ariella's word, is that the archives can provide a potential history. The archives of the institution can provide a potential history of what that institution is, and what decolonization or abolition could mean for that institution, which is inherently a process. So yeah, that's about it. And so, I mean, the point is that we're exiting. We're exiting from the system to think about, what we make on our own. And in this process, it's also a shift of power. And it's important to kind of decentralize that power. So.
If I can just add two things. The first one is, it's also, museums should be a place. I mean, you don't need to say, we're just highlighting what is obvious. I mean, curators come from care, but there's zero care in these institutions right now. There's zero care for the staff. There's zero care for the workers. And we know this from Moma. You have no idea what the leadership is doing to people inside as a way to fight this. It's kind of crazy. And, the second thing I want to share is just like the amount of work that has gone into the 10 weeks. So this was right after the letter. 300 people blockade the entrance of Moma, and teach-ins are done. This was the same day the Angela Davis and Fred Moten and 250, including some people on this call, have signed. There was, they would call the police on people. They say they're for protest, they wouldn't let people enter. So one of the things that like this kind of organizing, what it's doing is that it's also exposing things. In a way, we do this kind of work so we can have a more informed conversation here amongst each other, right? So this work, we're generating knowledge in the process. Or the way, we had leaks come out of Moma, right? We're on multiple signal channels with people that work there, in the archive, in the library, at the ticketing, right? What they're telling them. They're using counterinsurgency tactics, literally splitting people up. And then the final thing I'll say is, like, when we think about these conversations, we need to recognize the things that also separate us. So we're fighting kind of vertical power, but we need to recognize the debts and the power that we have over each other in certain contexts, whether it be class privilege, whether it be race, gender and sexual orientation. These things are not separate. We don't get united against an enemy. It's the process of building together in which these things also need to be addressed in the process of struggle and working. And that's what, Strike Moma is also offering.
Maybe I can share the events thing now so that I'm done with sharing the screen. And then, so this is something, this is a conversation happening tomorrow. It's along these same lines, what does exiting mean? What does, abolition and decolonization mean with institutions? What is, where our movements are at? This is with Sandy Grande, Stefano Harney, Feb Moran just before, and Dhillon Rodriguez. It will also be available online. We will also be live streaming it via our IG account. This is on Friday. This is a teach-in happening around Mumia, and then Move, and just like museums in general, and comrades and uprisings in Colombia. This is at the space itself. This is at Urban Plaza at 4 p.m. And this is the digital teach-in, which I think Amin sent the link for earlier. We're gonna just give an update on where Strike Moma is at, but also do a teach-in on like Colombia and the solidarity with Palestine. That's it.
Lesson it. Yeah.